According to recent industry research, more than 80% of organizations report growing concerns about data jurisdiction, regulatory compliance, and control over critical digital infrastructure, making technology sovereignty one of the fastest growing priorities in enterprise IT and government leaders all around the world. My name is Paul Nashawaty. I'm the practice lead and principal analyst for the AppDev practice, and I'm joined by Andreas from SUSE. Andreas, you are very knowledgeable about this topic. Welcome to the podcast today. Why don't you introduce yourself and introduce the company?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm indeed here on behalf of SUSE, the largest European open software provider, and obviously having a global presence, but we're located and headquartered in Europe. And SUSE, I would argue, is very often the most invisible company that every consumer is touching on a daily basis. We have Linux, we have Kubernetes, and a lot of systems around that, and a lot of stacks built on top. So whether or not you made a payment or you use your navigation, there must be somewhere some Kubernetes or a cloud service underneath. And then big chances there was SUSE from a product perspective. What I'm doing actually at SUSE is I'm leading a very small strategic team that has a focus on sovereignty, or if you like, sovereign solutions. So taking the entire SUSE product package, the services, the knowledge that we have, as well as a partner ecosystem, and help a lot of the countries across the globe and companies in these countries to become more resilient, more sovereign, more independent from foreign influence. So it's a bit of go-to-market, a bit of product, a bit of positioning. And it's a joyful job at the moment with sovereignty as one of the hot topics going on.
Well, Andreas, always a pleasure talking to you. I mean, we were just talking recently at SUSECon. It was good seeing you out there in Prague. But I'll tell you, data sovereignty is emerging as one of the most consequential topics and technology discussions enterprises are facing today, right? Governments and service providers worldwide are always experiencing this thing. So in this episode, we're looking to really explore how organizations are navigating the growing demands of control, resiliency, and strategic independence while looking at your perspective, right? SUSE's perspective on sovereignty and also some of your recent announcements from SUSECon, because I think those are pertinent to this, but also the potential impact of the European Commission's forthcoming, or I should say now out, EU tech sovereignty package, right? So Andreas, let's explore sovereignty strategies, industry trends, and implications around the EU upcoming tech sovereignty package. This is a big area that we're looking at, right? So what are your thoughts there?
Well, the first one, right, where you started with data sovereignty, right? And for many companies, this is top of mind. And I would argue that's obvious, because in times when our entire company is IT, right, data, right, is the oil, data is the gold, data is who we are, right? So taking care of data is really important. But what I've seen in the field by speaking to so many executives, as well as from our research that we've conducted and launched at SUSECon, is that data aspect is just one of the four bigger transformations that need to go on. The other one is really that companies need to revisit their entire technology stack, right? An architecture type of thinking. What about my exit strategy, my pivotability, right? How does my technology look like? Still doable, but much more longer term, right, in how slow the transformation will go. Then a third element is really crucial, and that's all about contracts, right? There's a big move going on, and where in the past, right, the SaaS supplier or the large vendor would just push his T's and C's, terms and conditions. Now companies, governments, right, are more capable and powerful to drive change there as well. And then what we've discovered is the fourth element, sometimes holding back the overall sovereignty pivot or transformation, is the people aspect. Because if you're so used to run VMs with vSphere, or if you're so used to run Linux the Red Hat way, right, it's very hard to actually learn a new practice, right? And then the AI boost on top is really putting pressure on the people, like always, but yet again, in this larger transformation as well. So when people say data, that's absolutely true, right? Data residency, where does it live? Data access, right? Who controls the keys to get to the data, as well as data ownership, right? Runs it on systems that belong to you, or do the systems actually belong to someone else? So these are just a few broader perspectives to that. Now, go ahead.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think I like the conversation where it was going. I mean, one of the things that was very apparent to me is digital sovereignty. Andreas, was really moving from a conversation that was done typically at the regional level, regional policy level, and now it's becoming more of a global business priority, right? We were having a lot of conversations in Europe around moving content, data, material, and information from global clouds to more sovereign clouds that were in country. So from your perspective, what are you hearing around different areas, different conferences around the world, and why is sovereignty becoming such a strategic issue for enterprises and governments today versus just even a few years ago? It seemed like everybody was like, hey, we're going to move to the cloud, and the hyperscalers were good enough. And now it's like, well, we don't need that. We actually want to move from the major hyperscalers to a sovereign solution. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah. So what we've seen in the research and also from all of our conversations, to your point, the move is across the globe. We interviewed more than 300 people in Japan, India, the US, France, and Germany, and they all say sovereignty is a hot topic. What is very interesting is that half of them are actively investing in a strategy that will transform their underlying IT stack, right? So there's really a big move, as in the willingness to plan, and already 43% has some kind of a strategy in place. So that makes almost, right, the entire set of companies changing globally. That's one. Now, where the change is happening the fastest, I would argue, or the awareness, because change is slow, but the awareness is very much in verticals or sectors, if you like, that have a lot of a focus, much more regional or much more private citizen type of data. So we see a bunch of sectors, obviously the public sector, mission critical infrastructure, think about bridges, harbors, power grids, the utility type of stuff, healthcare, right? And then predominantly hospitals, etc. And then the defense, right? It's a little bit regional, but very much country oriented. And then banking. And these are the kind of the 5 groups where telco is included. These are kind of the 5-6 groups that are moving the most aware. And I do think for a reason, because if you take down any of these verticals, literally the country might stop in minutes, in hours, and definitely in days. That's one driver. The other driver, what I see, is for many companies, including our own, we run a global business, right? So even if we would repatriate all of our workloads to Europe or all of our workloads to the US, which are the most dominant groups for us in the company, you're still not free from foreign influence, right? And many companies, many of our customers are global companies, right? So we see a kind of a vertical business-oriented pivot. At the same time, I must admit that all companies are becoming more aware of their tech stack and making decisions, but not necessarily to repatriate workloads, but much more to drive portability of workloads, right? So when necessary, they can move rather than stick into it.
Yeah, Andreas, we're seeing in our own research that 20% of respondents indicate that application portability is critical to their environment. But I want to talk a little bit about virtualization and workload repatriation. You mentioned those two words. That's an important kind of discussion to have. SUSE has been really vocal about its approach in digital sovereignty and made several announcements at SUSECon, right? And the themes that were there around the announcements were reflecting on the evolving needs of customer operations. And this is also, you touched on this just now, but I want to double click down on it, the increasing complex geopolitical environments. How is that really impacting the virtualization and workload repatriation? Is it really a big push, or is it just a lot of hype right now?
Well, if I take a look at the movements, we are early on. Let's be open and honest, right? And a lot of companies still renewed for yet the final 2 years with VMware, right? Let's face facts. That's what's happening at the moment. However, we do start to see, right, that many companies have acknowledged that they need to move and start to move the first workloads around. So at SUSECon, we announced a partnership with Cloudbase, and they have an amazing migration capability, Coriolis. And with that, what we actually can do is move a vSphere managed VM into a SUSE virtualization managed VM, right? That's one part of the transition. The second part of the transition that we can do is also take out, imagine that we run Red Hat Linux or another Linux distribution, we can migrate at the same time to a SUSE distribution, a SUSE managed Linux. And then the third element is we can move them from any location to a more localized hosting provider. So companies that say, hey, I want to become more sovereign, and they go through the VM migration, I'm not saying they need to get rid of VMs, but just go to a more open, auditable, inspectable type of technology. Well, then SUSE virtualization is an amazing target, and they can run various transformations at once while moving the workloads to a new destination. And that's what we see happening time over time. We see a lot of our partners. In Germany, for example, we launched with FocusNet and migration service, and we see a lot of these initiatives happening. And I do think the VM space, to close off with, is a kind of a unique area, because, I mean, everyone knows, right? The pricing and the partner ecosystem has changed that much, right? That they feel the urge to move. And then for SUSE customers, what is beautiful is you can manage VMs and containers kind of in the same philosophy side by side. So also from a knowledge perspective, that's extremely helpful for engineers that are in operations to manage these machines.
Let's talk about that a little bit more, because I think there's a balance here. There's progression, modernization, kind of moving towards the next generation of where organizations are moving to. There's regulation, compliance, governance that go into effect. But many organizations are really trying to balance innovation, cloud adoption, and AI. AI is a big one here, right? And as well as regulatory requirements. They're all trying to balance it simultaneously. So there's a lot of things happening. And sovereignty strategies that help customers maintain flexibility and control, really without sacrificing those modernization efforts, are really going to win, right? So if you kind of look at it, what we were discussing at SUSECon was the ability to have that, I'll call it a crawl, walk, run approach, right? Where you basically have the ability to the customer can enter that journey anywhere in that journey. They can hit it full throttle and go in a very mature approach, or they can start and like dip their toe in and go, okay, we're going to move a little bit at a time. And that kind of hybrid approach right now is really what organizations are looking at, especially when you start looking at adding in AI to it. So Andreas, when we look at this, what does this mean from a overall perspective, balancing all these different pulls on your team? Sovereignty is one, right? Repatriation is part of that, but like there's also, you need to innovate. And by the way, this little thing called AI is bugging people too. So what does this all mean?
Yeah, so I'm glad you're calling this out. So what we've seen in the last months, I would literally call months, right? Half year, a year, is these bigger transformations are no longer happening at the director level, not even at the VP level, but we're having a lot of executive C-suite type of conversations. Because ultimately, if you boil it down, all of these elements are about the company's existence in the longer term. So if you neglect migrating away from closed proprietary pieces of software, and the Cloud and AI Development Act kicks in place, which was launched 2 days ago, ultimately, right, you are running on a stack that's not inspectable, not auditable, right, and you're not complying to regulation. Plus, right, pricing goes up. So that's one aspect. If you don't do that, the other element, right, if you're not investing in your AI journey, well, it might take another 5 years or 10 years, but you will be out of business, right? Because the productivity of your workforce will go down. So you need to figure out how to use AI as well as how to position AI towards my end customers. And neglecting that is yet again a challenge. And then the third big driver, I would argue, is companies are becoming much more aware that from a workload perspective, it's definitely not one size fits all. And there's a lot more of the mission, business critical software, the regular workloads, and then just whatever, right? Not so important workloads. And we start to see that these executives start to develop a very nuanced perspective to it. So that's, I would argue, from regular business. Now, there's one distinction, what we expect in the years to come, because the Cloud Act I mentioned is launched, and it's written for the public sector, but there are extremely prescriptive, well, not forcing yet, but absolutely recommending open source as the foundation, and also recommending that public sector, and therefore also telco and healthcare, need to develop a open source secondary alternative next to their own stack. So you see the wording like a dual vendor type of strategy, which I do think is good, because that's another way of lowering the risk. And that's where all these four elements are ultimately about. And that's why it's becoming a executive conversation, is how do you manage the risk from an IT perspective in the longer term for your company.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to gloss over this because this is incredibly important. In the milestones that we hit here, the European Commission has now released the EU tech sovereignty packages this week, right? So this is real fresh information that just come up, right? So, but like when you think about that, what are your expectations for these initiatives, and how can we, influence the technology procurement, infrastructure decisions, and innovation across Europe and beyond? Because these are not closed by boundaries. These are closed. This is a, build it, and it's a global impact. What does that mean to the ecosystem?
Yeah, let's have this conversation in 2 years, right? And then we know in hindsight what the impact was. But we think it's pretty dramatic. And the first reason is, in the first time in history, open source got its own chapter in new and upcoming regulation. So that's very important. The acknowledgement that open source is a very important driver to become autonomous, right, or sovereign, is now a given. That's one. The second important push that you start to see is that it needs to be EU, right? So companies needs to be more local, and that's in contrast, right, of what we've seen for many, many years. So that's an important change. But if you open up the hundreds of pages, you also start to see words like software supply chain and silicon produced in Europe. So Europe is taking their autonomy very serious, right, and is considering to invest more and more into this. And it's saying open source first. It's not forcing. There's no auditable process yet, but all these regulations still need to be debated. So there's a very solid lobby going on. SUSE is leading a big coalition in Europe of more than 100 companies that say, hey, open source first, need to be a mandate that's auditable and inspectable if you come to other conclusions. So we expect that open source will also be maintained much more. The law is, or the suggestion is, that there will be a fund focused on open source maintenance. And all these aspects are super important to build a solid European ecosystem, because many startups, when they go for Series A or B, they go outside Europe, right? And then IP is leaving Europe, etc. So I'm expecting not only more adoption of open source and European products across Europe, but also that we start to build a more solid ecosystem over here in Europe. And it's ultimately up to public sector and the companies, supply and demand, to make that happen. A lot of work to do, but absolutely into the right direction.
Definitely work to do, and definitely interesting times ahead. Let's talk about that. We're going to look at a prediction here, looking out ahead 3 to 5 years, right? We're looking at where it's going and where this is happening. Where do you see digital sovereignty becoming a standard requirement for enterprises and technology platforms globally, right? Where do you see this, and how do you see it? Is it similar to cybersecurity and data privacy today? And what does this mean for the broader technology ecosystem? Because as we start looking at this, a lot of organizations are trying to hedge their bets on not locking into vendors, not locking into solutions that are going to box them out, but they're looking at things that will help them become more scalable and agile in the future. What are your thoughts here?
It will definitely be a theme, right? Whether or not the word sovereignty will remain, that's the question. But digital resilience is definitely a theme that will last much longer than the next 1 or 2 years. That's one. I do think what we will see is the rise of open source as a very solid driver underneath that movement. That's the second one. I talked about the ecosystem to support that. Now, if you think about cyber, however, right, and sovereignty, there are different elements that you need to apply, right? There's no web application firewall, vulnerability scanning, right? All these elements that are very engineering, network, platform focused are slightly different from a sovereignty perspective. But I expect, where in the past it was really one size fits all, right? I go only for one vendor. I do think we move more and more, like the telco is doing for years, to a dual vendor strategy. So open standards are becoming more important. So there's interoperability between the standards. So that's a very important driver where I'm expecting we'll see. Now, also, I do think it's not a one size fits all from what are the types of workloads. So I do expect that a lot of workloads will remain on the hyperscaler, right? Because you're a global company, but that some of the most critical ones might come closer to home and managed in that particular way. So Lots of strategizing. One final comment. Also, the Cloud and AI Development Act is making a strong point for OSPOs, open source policy officers. It's a kind of unknown yet, but it tells you that the OSPO becomes a very important influencer, like the enterprise architect, in, hey, what are the decisions I make? And is there an open source variant, right, that helps my business to become more resilient? So expect a lot in the next 2 to 3 years of a role like this.
A lot to consider here, a lot to think about, and a lot to understand. But before we wrap up, Andreas, we talked about a lot here. We talked about what was happening at SUSECon and what SUSE is doing. Where would our audience here go to learn more about what SUSE is doing, and where should they go to find out this information?
Well, I would almost argue, and it's a little bit selfish, but follow me on LinkedIn. I post so frequently, and there's so much news coming out that almost updating the website, the Sovereign Solution page, is close to impossible with the speed of development. So we're launching products, but also the market is moving with launches of new regulation. So follow me on LinkedIn, and you'll see all the greatest and the latest news.
Excellent. Well, Andreas, always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you. A big thank you to all of you who tuned in. We do appreciate you being part of the AppDevANGLE community. But for now, that wraps up this episode. And we'll be back next Wednesday with another conversation diving into the tools, trends, and talent shaping the future of application development. So whether you're deploying at the edge, building with AI, or modernizing your cloud stack, we've got you covered. Be sure to follow us on social if you have any thoughts, questions, or just want to connect. Until next time, stay curious and stay building.